Undercover boss buys breakfast, learns she hasn't paid rent in 2 months Wednesday morning. The sky over Elmridge was a pale gray, as if it hadn't quite woken up yet. Thin drops of rain, not enough to soak a jacket, fell gently over the cobblestone path leading toward the New Dawn Cafe in Elmridge district. A small shop tucked between boutique stores and Pilat's studios, where newcomers had the habit of ordering cappuccinos in Italian and paying with their smartwatches. Michael Foster, 50 years old, founder of New Dawn Cafe, walked in wearing a simple gray windbreaker, a cap covering half his face, looking like any other regular. He picked the table by the glass window, a spot where he could watch the street and listen without drawing attention. He ordered avocado toast with egg and a black coffee, no sugar. Then flipped open a small notebook, pretending to jot something down. But in truth, his eyes were quietly scanning every detail of the space, the way staff moved, how customers reacted, and especially the waitress who just walked over. Sophie. A young girl, thin figure, brown hair, tied back in a messy knot, and eyes unusually bright despite the deep shadows under them. Sophie placed the toast on the table, gently offering a soft smile. "Enjoy your meal." "Would you like anything else?" Michael just gave a small shake of the head, replying with a look of quiet appreciation. She turned away, still holding the tray, weaving through the tables with a strange calmness. Not rushed, not careless, just measured. And something about her felt resigned. About 5 minutes later, while Sophie stood behind the drink station, Michael overheard her whisper to a coworker, "I haven't paid rent. In 2 months, the landlord said he'll change the locks next week." It wasn't loud, but it wasn't soft either. Just enough to cut through the soft jazz in the background. Just enough to stop a man like Michael, a man who had sat through countless board meetings, read hundreds of financial reports, right in the middle of an untouched bite of toast. He looked up toward the counter. Sophie was still working like nothing had happened, wiping a pitcher, checking fresh orders from the machine. Same steps. Same smile as she handed a drink to a customer. Only now Michael knew something was happening behind that smile. A secret. One that his own system, knowingly or not, was helping push people like Sophie toward the edge. He looked down at the toast. Soft-boiled eggs still warm. Butter melting evenly across the crispy slice. Everything was exactly right, just like the hundreds of times he'd reviewed food standards across branches. But this time, the taste felt different. Because now he knew the one who brought that toast was living in fear of losing her home. A piece of toast should never come with an eviction notice. Michael folded his arms. His eyes lowered. The cafe was still full. People still chatting. Still snapping food photos for social media. But in his mind, the noise vanished. And then he noticed something strange. Sophie always kept to the inside of the counter, avoiding the eyes of her manager, a man with neatly combed hair holding a tablet, signaling more with glances than with words. Each time Sophie was a few seconds late, he raised an eyebrow. Each time she asked for a short break, he shook his head. No yelling. But it was a silent pressure just sharp enough to make someone feel small in the very place they worked every day. Michael exhaled slowly, then jotted a brief note in his notebook. Sophie, bright eyes, lowered shoulders. A worker who knew how to smile, but didn't know where she'd sleep next week.
He closed the notebook,
Scanned the room one more time, and made a quiet promise this time he wouldn't walk away with just a receipt. This time he wanted to know the real reason why someone as hardworking as Sophie was being pushed to the very edge by something as basic as rent. New Dawn Elmridge District opens at 6 a.m. daily. The branch sits right at the intersection of Maple Street and Elmridge Central Station, a spot now considered the heartbeat of the city for the past 2 years since the area was taken over by tech employees and startups. Outside, the cafe is painted a soft beige with rounded wooden window frames. The letters New Dawn Cafe shine gently under the early sunlight. Inside, self-order kiosks, contactless payment, minimalist furniture creating a modern, trendy vibe. One wall is decorated with dried flowers and soft yellow lights, the selfie corner where customers line up daily to capture the perfect shot. Everything was crafted to feel light, as if this was a place you could step into, set the world aside, order a toast, a latte, and stay for as long as you'd like. But behind the bar, behind those carefully crafted heart-shaped lattes, were real people surviving on minimum wage in a neighborhood that was becoming suffocatingly expensive. Among them, Sophie, 24 years old, stood out. Every morning, she arrived 15 minutes before opening. Her uniform was always pressed, hair braided neatly on both sides. Her shoes old but spotless. She was the first to say good morning to every guest and the last to check the restroom before leaving the cafe. Sophie didn't live in Elmridge. She rented a room in the suburbs over 11 miles away, where a one-bedroom was still under $1 a month. To make it on time, she had to leave the house at 4:45 a.m., catch 2 buses, transfer at Grandview Crossing, then walk the final stretch. Michael had been watching her from afar for several days. At first, just curiosity. How does someone smile every morning like clockwork? But then tiny cracks began to show beneath the polished surface like hairline fractures in a painted wall. One day he saw Sophie take 2 sugar packets and slip them into her pocket. Not for coffee, but to eat. She placed them later into an old lunch container inside, where just a few dry white bread slices and a used tea bag to be rebrewed. On a rainy morning, her socks were wet. She took them off and laid them near the heater. Michael heard her laugh to a coworker. "It's fine. I couldn't get them dry last night. My place doesn't have a dryer." Another time, while pouring water for a customer, she whispered into an old phone, "I'm still working, Mom, don't worry. The landlord hasn't kicked me out yet." Piece by piece, a picture formed, one Michael could no longer ignore. A young woman clinging to her job like it was the only thread connecting her to city life. A cafe that served hot breakfast every morning, but sent its own employees home with an empty stomach. Customers kept coming. Other young staff laughed, chatted cheerfully. But Sophie, she stayed right in the middle. Enough to please customers. Never enough to stand out. She worked hard, but somehow never got the weekend shifts. The peak hours. The ones with triple the tips. Michael asked a few of the cafe's managers. All he got were vague replies. "Oh, Sophie, she's sweet, but not as outgoing as the others." Maybe she didn't ask for those shifts. Makes sense, though she lives far. A quiet indifference disguised under polite words. A system built to run smoothly, as long as no one talks about housing or money. Sophie's financial instability wasn't recorded in HR files, wasn't reflected in monthly keys, and certainly didn't show up in any payroll spreadsheet. But it was obvious in how she walked into work clutching an empty thermos, eyes down, yet always smiling at just the right moment when a customer looked up. Michael opened his notebook and began writing. "You can serve 100 toast plates a day, but still not earn enough to keep a roof. That's not a job. That's a slow tug of war, pulling life out of the hands of decent people." And then something small happened, but it made him freeze. That day, Sophie was clearing a table when Michael saw her pick up an old receipt. She flipped it over and wrote something on the back in tiny handwriting. When he walked past, she quickly folded it and slipped it into her apron pocket. Another staff member saw it too and whispered, "That's her list of what to do if she gets evicted. She keeps it on her all the time. Guess it helps her stay strong." Michael didn't ask, but something inside him shifted. He had sat in hundreds of New Dawn cafes across the country, but never once had he felt a lump in his throat like this. It wasn't because the toast was too salty or the coffee too bitter. It was because the very people making them were living on the edge of being pushed out of the city, and no one seemed to care. Michael Foster returned to the Elmridge branch of New Dawn earlier than usual that day. The air was still foggy. Sunlight hadn't pierced through the eastern skyline yet. He picked a seat closer to the bar, notebook in hand, but didn't write a thing. He wasn't here to take notes. Today he came to observe. Sophie entered the cafe. The clock showed 6:27 a.m. She greeted the manager, quickly put on her apron, then began stacking cups, checking the espresso machine, wiping up watermarks left from the night shift. She didn't notice that Michael was sitting closer than usual. Understandable, he had changed jackets, swapped the baseball cap for an old beanie. His hair a little messier than usual. The less attention, the better. A few minutes later, as Sophie turned to grab the order ticket for table 3, something slipped out of her apron. A crumpled piece of paper. Not an order. Not a receipt. And definitely not one of those sticky notes he'd seen her use before. Michael leaned forward to pick it up, but froze the moment he caught sight of the handwriting in faded blue ink, second month unpaid. Mom says not to worry, but she's also about to be evicted. Short sentences. But the handwriting didn't shake. It looked practiced, like that hand had written these same words over and over on scrap paper, old receipts, the back of instant noodle boxes. Michael didn't call out to Sophie. He didn't ask anything. Instead, he folded the paper, gently placed it back on the edge of the table, as if he'd never picked it up. Then he pulled out his notebook and wrote a single quiet line, a girl who serves hundreds each week yet can't find a place to sleep. A heavy feeling spread across his chest. Not because of the amount written on the paper, but because of the silence behind it. In all his years, running New Dawn, Michael had visited countless locations, heard many stories, but never had a single scrap of paper. Just a few lines made it impossible to finish his toast. He looked over at Sophie, now softly smiling as an elderly customer walked in. She nodded politely, reached out to take the receipt, and thanked them in her usual calm tone. Someone like that, living in fear of having her locks changed next week, Michael turned away. But his ears caught the quiet words. Sophie muttered as she headed to the counter, "I'll figure it out." As long as I get enough shifts this week, the word figure echoed in his mind like a scratch on a record. Why should someone working full-time, never missing a day, loved by customers, have to figure it out? He scribbled more in his notebook. Too many people are spinning around things that should have stayed still. When Sophie returned, she had no idea the paper had been seen. No idea that from that moment forward, something inside Michael had shifted. He was no longer just a CEO in disguise. He was a man who had seen a truth that couldn't be tucked away beneath a linen tablecloth or a cheap brown paper one. He hadn't said a word yet, but he knew what needed to be done. Michael began returning to the Elm Ridge branch, more often, no longer sitting quietly as a casual customer. He started noting every observation into the small notebook tucked in his coat, each shift change, each subtle glance, every tired face when the clock struck 7 a.m. Sophie still showed up on time, always among the first to unlock the doors. But Michael noticed something else. She was never scheduled for the busiest shifts. Weekend slots when crowds flooded Central Station, when New Dawn was packed. Her name was nowhere to be found. One day, he pretended to drop a napkin, leaned down, and snapped a photo of the shift schedule posted under the counter. Sophie's name was crossed out, replaced with Melissa Priority Shift. Melissa was new, sweet, outgoing, but not the most senior, not the highest rated. So why was she getting priority? Michael took a slow sip of coffee. He was beginning to see cracks in a wall he once believed was strong. Another day, he ordered the buttered egg toast, knowing Sophie would bring it. When the receipt came, he reached out and said quietly, "I'll leave the tip in cash." "Okay," Sophie smiled and nodded. But minutes later, he saw Ken, the branch manager, walk out from the back room holding the tip jar. Then poured all of it into an envelope labeled lunch shift pooled. No names listed. No trace of who earned what. Michael immediately opened his laptop, logged into the internal system, one only CEOs could access. Inside the automatic tip distribution records, every order he had watched, clearly labeled server, Sophie was marked unspecified, tip pooled by shift. A chill ran down his spine, not because of the money, but because of how deliberately it was hidden. He ordered another coffee just to get closer again. Sophie walked out from the kitchen, slightly out of breath, collar damp with sweat. She leaned in and said, "Sorry for the wait. I just finished cleaning the back." The A/C broke again. Michael nodded lightly. But what caught his attention wasn't the cup. It was a shift calendar Sophie accidentally dropped, as she pulled her notebook from her apron. On it, her weekly schedule constantly changing. 1 week, 6 days, but all low traffic hours. The next, only 3 shifts, all during the quietest times. In bright red ink at the edge of the paper, handwritten, "No priority for those who aren't flexible." Michael frowned. That wasn't language meant for someone who worked hard and took 2 buses every day just to get to this cafe. That was the language of someone who viewed staff as numbers, interchangeable, discardable, adjustable like inventory. That night, Michael logged back into the shift system. With his access, he could view the entire schedule history. 3 weeks ago, Sophie had requested extra hours. Her reason was clearly noted: "I need more hours to help pay rent." Ken's response was also recorded. Just one word: no. No period. No reason. No explanation. Michael checked the customer feedback section next. Every line with Sophie's name had 5 stars. "She always smiles. Fast and friendly. I keep coming back because of her." Michael wrote down every line. Sophie was loved by customers, but not prioritized by management. She asked for more shifts, but was denied. She earned tips, but never received her fair share. This wasn't coincidence. This was a system. A system running smoothly under soft yellow lights, while quietly grinding down the kindest people inside it. One morning, Michael arrived early. Sophie was cleaning behind the counter. She opened her thermos, poured out a bit of hot water, then dipped in a used tea bag tied together with a rubber band. No bread, no snack, just hot water faintly tinted with flavor from an old tea bag. Michael said nothing, but his hand clenched the notebook hard enough to crease the paper edges. In his mind, one sentence rang out: how can someone serve breakfast to hundreds of people when they can't even have a decent dinner themselves? And he knew he couldn't sit there and take notes anymore. He had to act. Friday morning. The air inside New Dawn Elmridge was thick with coffee and shouted orders. Customers filled every space from the patio outside to the crowded counter inside. It was peak hour. Michael Foster sat at his usual corner table. An espresso sat untouched in his hand. His eyes never left Sophie, who had just delivered water to table 6, then turned back to the counter after being reprimanded by the manager for the 2nd time that hour. The young woman moved quickly, slipping a receipt into her apron, adjusting her tray. But as she leaned past one table, Michael noticed her hand trembled. Not from rush, but from exhaustion. He stood up. No noise, no haste, but the entire cafe seemed to freeze for a moment. He walked to the center of the floor. "Excuse me, I have a question." A pause. All the staff looked up. Some customers turned. Ken, the branch manager, stepped out from the back room, frowning. Michael looked him dead in the eye. His voice low but clear. "Why is the highest-rated staff member by customers the only one who never gets weekend shifts?" No one answered. No one laughed. Michael glanced towards Sophie. She still stood there, eyes locked on the tray in her hands, like she wished she could disappear into the steam of the espresso machine. He continued, voice gentler now, but firm. "And why is the person serving breakfast to hundreds of guests each week the same person who doesn't have a home to return to after their shift?" The sound of spoons in the kitchen stopped. Ken stepped forward, mumbling something about policy, performance-based scheduling, composite evaluations. But each word only made the air heavier. A nearby employee, Carla, glanced unconsciously at Sophie. The young woman simply bowed her head, her fingers tightening around the edge of her rag until her knuckles turned white. Michael slowly removed his cap, then took off his round glasses. "I'm Michael Foster, founder of New Dawn Cafe." A breath escaped from somewhere in the corner. Customers started murmuring. "And I've heard enough, seen enough." He turned to Ken. "Now I want to hear from you. Why, in a system we call fair, is there someone sleeping on a bus bench just to come in and serve so-called warm breakfasts?" Ken flushed. Took a step back. Mouth open, but no words came. No one said anything. No one needed to. Because everything had already been said through every missing receipt, every ignored email, every unnecessary reprimand, and every dinner Sophie quietly skipped. Michael looked around, not like a CEO, but like a man trying to remember why he started a coffee shop in the first place. Because he believed breakfast is the kindest thing one human can share with another. He turned to Sophie. "What time does your shift end today?" Sophie didn't lift her head. But she softly replied, 4 p.m. Michael gave a slight nod. "After your shift, I'd like to treat you to a proper dinner and a serious conversation. Not because I'm the CEO, but because I believe you deserve to be heard." A single teardrop fell onto the metal table in front of Sophie. She didn't look up, but her lips quivered as they pressed into a thin line. Not from fear, but because for the first time, someone truly saw her. The calf was silent, but in that silence, something shifted. Softly, but undeniably, as if someone had just lit a small flame in the heart of everyone present. And that morning, Michael didn't need breakfast. He needed the truth. And now he was ready to face all of it. Less than 2 hours after the confrontation between Michael and Ken at the service counter, the new Dawn Tech team arrived at the Elm Ridge District branch. It wasn't just another morning at the CAF. The atmosphere had shifted, like everyone could feel something important was being uncovered. Michael sat at the back table with a systems engineer and the head of HR. Laptop open. Data logs scrolling line by line. "Start from last month," he said. "Filter transactions with tip notes like for Sophie's or the brown-haired girl." Several entries popped up, but none were registered in the internal tip distribution system. "And how are these revenues distributed?" Michael asked. The engineer flipped to the next dashboard. All those transactions had been pooled. No recipient names. Labeled under standard ratio, split a setting. Ken had full control over week to week. Michael leaned in. "Do we have a weekly shift assignment record? With just a few clicks, the schedule appeared." Sophie had not been assigned a single weekend shift in the past 8 weeks. Even though her customer reviews were always 5 stars, the highest in the entire branch. Then an internal email from Ken popped up. "No further explanation needed. The ones who work hard but don't kiss up, give them just enough hours. They'll quit, eventually." Michael didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Bring up last week's team meeting audio." The HR manager hesitated, then opened the file. A voice unmistakable rang out clearly in the meeting room, Ken's voice. "That Sophie girl wants more hours. Let her know what it feels like to not afford rent. She'll learn real life." No one in the CAF said a word, but the mood shifted. A senior barista looked down quietly, wiping away tears. Sophie stood a few steps away, motionless. Her hand gripped the edge of her towel until her knuckles turned white. She didn't look at Michael, but her eyes drifted somewhere far, as if her soul had just stepped out of a place it could no longer trust. Michael slowly stood, closed the laptop. He didn't need to slam the table, didn't need to raise his voice. His next words were just a truth no one could deny. "We don't run cafes to make money off people who can't afford to live." Ken hadn't moved, but his body trembled as if each of his own past words were echoing back as a sentence. Michael turned to the rest of the staff, looked at every face, many he'd never met yet, all somehow familiar in a deeply human way. "If you've ever had your hours cut, been pushed to resign without reason, been switched last minute without warning, I want to hear your story. Not by email, not on a form, but right now, in person." A moment of silence. Then a young barista stepped out from behind the counter. Then the morning shift waitress. Then a janitor quietly took off her gloves and nodded. Michael took a nearby chair, opened his notebook, placed his pen down, and wrote no one should have to beg just to work enough to survive. Not at New Dawn. Sophie said nothing. But as she turned to walk back inside, something had shifted. Her back stood a little straighter. Her hand still held the towel, but it no longer trembled. Sometimes justice doesn't come through grand speeches. It comes when the truth is spoken out loud under the brightest lights, and no one can say they didn't hear it. Monday morning. As soon as the office opened, Michael called an emergency meeting with HR and the regional operations director. No PowerPoint, no spreadsheets, just a thick file laid at the center of the table, internal emails, shift logs, tip distribution reports, and one audio recording. "I want this resolved within 72 hours, Michael said, eyes locked on every person in the room. "We don't keep anyone who lets a system grow where staff live in fear for simply doing their job well." The silence in the room was dense like smoke from a kitchen fire. 2 days later, a system-wide announcement was issued. Ken was suspended indefinitely pending formal investigation. An independent review board was launched to audit all locations with similar concerns. Staff who had been forced into shift changes, tip cuts, or denied hours without reason would be contacted directly. But what moved people most wasn't in any document. Wednesday afternoon, Michael walked into a local real estate agency and personally signed a rental guarantee for Sophie, the waitress he'd been quietly ordering toast and coffee from all week long, so she could rent a small apartment just 4 minutes from the cafe. The room wasn't large, but it was clean, had a window facing a small park, and most importantly, a lock she could turn from the inside. That night, Sophie stepped into the apartment with her old backpack, no longer crashing on a friend's sofa, no longer unsure of where to sleep, but a resident with an address, someone who had a right to sit at her own table and turn on her own light without asking permission. A few days later, Michael returned to Elmridge, same corner seat, same view where he first heard that whispered sentence between the clatter of cups. On the wall near the clock, a new wooden plaque had been installed. No fancy design, no corporate logo, just a single line carved cleanly: a place that serves breakfast should never make its servers skip dinner. He read the line twice, then sat in silence for a moment. At that exact moment, the side door of the cafe swung open. Sophie walked in, not hurried, not stressed. No sleeping bag, no foil-wrapped meal, just a small crossbody bag, hair tied back neatly, and the calm gaze of someone who knew she'd never again have to choose between dinner and rent. She caught Michael's eye, smiled, not to hide anything, not to impress, just a survivor, finally beginning to live. Michael nodded back at her. He didn't need to ask anything more, because in that moment, he knew everything had changed. Not just a new apartment, but a new system, a new mindset, a new promise that New Dawn wouldn't just open its doors to customers, but to real hope for the people behind the counter. That afternoon, Michael returned to his office. On his desk, a small package. No sender listed. He opened it. Inside, a folded note written in blue pen. "I never thought a single toast could lead to a home. Thank you for hearing me when no one else did. Sophie." Michael said nothing. He set the letter down, and for the first time in weeks, he poured himself a cup of hot tea. Outside his window, the sunset cast a soft glow across the buildings of Elmridge, where at least tonight, someone would sleep in a room with a lock of her own.